good over there?
My goodness, good evening, everyone, and welcome. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm going to try to do this without a microphone. We good? Okay. Welcome. My name is John Atkinson. I'm the director of the Signal Mountain Library. We are so pleased to be a part of this evening's event. The first in what just might become a series called the Signal Mountain. This notion of community is important at any time, of course, but perhaps especially now when we're all encouraged to view one another with suspicion and forget the common bonds that hold us together. Tonight, we're here to celebrate our shared humanity and to talk about how we might strengthen our own sense of community. Now, before I turn things over to our guests, I would like to quickly thank the people and sponsors who've made tonight possible. First of all, a big thank you to our host, the Mountain Arts Community Center. They've done a lot of hard work and coordination for us, and we truly appreciate it. If you'd like to express your gratitude to them, please consider making a donation, either through their website, which is signalmacc.org, or in the collection box in the lobby, or even Venmo. This facility does need our ongoing support, so please bear that in mind. The MAC is planning a benefit concert on Sunday, December the 8th for those in North Carolina affected by Hurricane Helene. More details on that will be announced soon, so keep an eye out for that. Second, the Friends of the Signal Mountain Library. Everyone, of course, but especially two of its members, Deborah Blake and Beth Dubold. All of this began as a spark of inspiration with these two, and they have moved heaven and earth to bring it to fruition. Next, I'd like to list in alphabetical order our local commercial sponsors. The Apple Orchard, Bees Sweets, The Bread Basket, The Cookie Lady, Mayfly Coffee, Southern Star Restaurant, and Webco Graphics and Printing. Finally, I would like to thank a few individuals who made special contributions. Alan Chico, our guitarist. Nancy Stagmeyer, the artist responsible for our beautiful backdrop. Erin Ritchie, our author's niece and manager. Will Gibbons, our charismatic host. And of course, the man of the hour, Allen Levi. One last thing, if you could all take a moment right now to silence your cell phones, that would be very much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, Theo of Golden.
Thank you.
Ellen's Wilted Halo, Christmas Shoes of Lamisha W., Pill Bottle of Bobo, Found Feather of the Absent Jay, October Sky Above the Oxbow, Oceanscape at Biscopo, the Blues of Golden were plentiful that year. Allen, this is a story of stories. As we get started, would you be willing to share with us just a little bit of your own? How is it that we get to come and be here tonight with Allen Levi of Harris County? Is this where you imagined that the story would go?
Never. Before I do that, let me start with thanks. We made Theo available to the public just about a year ago, a year and a couple of weeks, with no expectations whatsoever. As I will explain in just a minute, I never really wrote this book to be published. I just wanted to see if I could write a piece of long-form fiction. Well, in November, my dear friend Will Givens got a copy of the book. And he read it and took a shine to it, and he said something to Carter, who said something to Beth, who said something to Deborah, and then to Wells, and then to all of you. And it has been a delight to connect the dots working back when someone reaches out to us to say that they like the book. I've been a traveling musician for over 20 years. It's been a few years since I did that on a full-time basis. But as a musician, when I wrote a song, I was basically asking for an audience to give me 3.5 minutes of their time. So, you know, the cost to the audience was pretty minimal. What I've come to realize is that in writing a novel, I am asking people to give me 10 or 12 hours of their life. And with that has come this deep sense of responsibility that if that's what I am going to do, I owe it to a potential reader to give them something worth their while. And we were not sure when we put the book out that it was that. And so the fact that you have given that amount of your life to read this story, which, as you probably know, is the first novel I've written, is such a gift to me. And I just wanted to say as we begin, thank you so much, and thank you for being here this evening. I love your community. This is the first time I've been on Signal Mountain. I've been across, you know, a little to the south of you a bunch of times. But what a delightful community you have. And the fact that there are people here who read books, and not only read books, but are willing to come out for something like this and then be silly enough to clap one time at the end of every sponsor's name. What a wonderful thing. Yeah, so where did Theo come from? That's the question. I was standing in a coffee shop in my hometown of Columbus, Georgia, a few years ago. It's a coffee shop that I go to a lot. And there are 94 portraits on the walls of the coffee shop, all done by a dear friend of mine with whom I've collaborated in the past on a children's book and some other projects. And I was waiting for my coffee to come to me, and just as the novel says, all of the portraits are for sale. And I know many of the people in the frames, and I know that they are capable of buying the portraits, or somebody who loves them could buy the portrait, but they've been there for a long time. And I wondered, wouldn't it be fun, wouldn't it be interesting to buy all of them and find the people and give them their portrait? I still think that's a glorious idea. So the idea, the seed corn for the story was that, and I bought 5 of the portraits. I didn't know any of the people in the portraits, but I took them home and I leaned them against a wall, and this story started taking shape in my mind. So there was Manette, and there was Kendrick, and there was Ellen. And again, I didn't have a story in mind. I didn't really have a hardwired finish line or anything like that. I just wanted to see, can I finish a piece of long fiction? Because there is a book that I would like to write someday. And I thought, I want to learn the craft before I dive into the one that I really want to write. And so I started writing, and it was the most frustrating thing for someone who's used to writing 16 lines of lyric to write however many pages it is. It was very daunting to me. So there was a lot of stop and start. But, and I don't remember the year, but 2 or 3 years ago, I said, starting in January, I am going to finish this manuscript. And I'm going to put it in a drawer and say, I finished it, I'm going to pat myself on the back and then go on with life. And so I did that. And then some friends of mine encouraged me to do something with the manuscript. These are 5 fellows that I meet with every year for a long weekend. We're college buddies. And we get together just to encourage and catch up with one another. And they said, well, what about that thing you were writing? And I said, well, I finished it, I'm done. And they said, well, why can't we read it? And I said, well, you can read it. You can. And so they read it, and they were very encouraging, somewhat insistent, but they said, we want you to do something with this. And I have learned at 68 to trust people whose judgment is better than my own. And that is saying to trust a lot of people. There are a lot of people who I know have better judgment than me. But I deferred to their judgment, and I went back and polished up the manuscript, and then I hired my niece, Erin, and here we are. And it has been the most wonderful, wonderful experience because of people like you, and we're glad to be here tonight.
Now, Allen, you have worn a variety of hats. If I were trying to keep count, which I don't know if I can count that high, you have been an attorney, you have been a singer-songwriter, you've been a judge. When you get asked the question now of what do you do for a living, how do you answer?
Yeah, you know, it's a funny thing because I know, I'm still licensed to be a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer. I don't practice anymore. I'm not a judge, obviously. Singing, songwriting, that sort of thing, I do avocationally now. But I cannot get to the point yet that I feel at all comfortable saying I'm a writer. You know, I know that's what I do. And I hope that I will do more of this in the future, but I would be lying to say that I'm confident enough at this point to say I'm a writer. So I usually just try to get them off course and talk about something else, you know.
That sounds like somebody else said. So if you were to be called a writer,
Yeah.
what has been the biggest challenges of this new season of vocation?
Yeah. You know, it's just figuring it out. I live in a little town of less than 1,000 people. I live about 3.5 miles out of town. There's not a lot of cultural stimulation where I live. There are not many people that I can sit down with and bounce ideas off of. I've got lots of friends in Nashville, and I envy sometimes the community of creatives that they have there. I have none of that. And I've worked alone all my life, even as a musician. And it's hard for me to invite somebody in because I'm kind of hardwired to doing things the way I do. But I'd never written a novel before. And so just the volume of words and trying to put a story together, it was really, really frustrating. And I quit writing the book 20 times. I would write for a week, a month, and I would say, I don't have any story. I don't know where it's going. I had no plot line, no narrative, nothing. But I was thinking if I sit here long enough, something will bubble up. And it kind of did eventually. I mean, this is what bubbled up. But it was very inefficient. And again, going from writing short pieces of composition, music and lyric, to something like this was daunting. Mm-hmm. So I had to learn to sit still for long periods of time by myself, which I'm kind of wired to do, and leaned into it. And I'm satisfied with what we came up with here. But if you want to take a master class in inefficiency, just follow me around for a week. It is horrible. But I will say this. I've read some books by writers about writing because I love to read. I was telling some folks earlier today that for most of my adult life, I have not had a television. When I was in my 20s, I started law practice, and I would get home in the evenings, and I was wasting a lot of my time watching television just because I was exhausted at the end of the day. But I knew that there were things that I should be doing with my time, so I got rid of my television. I started writing more music, started reading voraciously. All of the books that we were assigned in high school and college and never read, the great books that honestly we were in no way ready to read at those ages. But I started reading a lot, and I took an interest in the way that writers put their books together. So when I started doing Theo, I've got a shelf in my home of books by writers about writing. And I started going back and kind of looking at those. The one that caught my imagination and was most helpful to me was one by Stephen King called On Writing. It's humorous, it's well written, and I've never read anything else by him, but it's obvious he is a really, really serious writer and a really smart guy. But he said when he starts to write a novel, he just has a situation. Nothing but, it could be as simple as a man sitting on a bench with his right arm over the backrest and a pair of very stylish, cool clothes that look very out of place next to the man that he's with on that particular night. That's the situation. And he said he starts writing and it turns into what it turns into. And so that was sort of the strategy that I set out with. Since then, I have heard an interesting conversation with Amor Towles. And he says that when he writes, he doesn't really call himself an author. He calls himself a story designer. And he'll spend a year or 2 years designing the story before he ever writes, as I understand it, writes a line of the book. But when he starts writing, he knows exactly where he's going. There's still room for mystery and magic to happen. in the creative process. But when I heard him say that, that sounded like preparing a case for trial. And I was a trial lawyer. And you do have to organize, and you kind of have to look at the end of the case and build up to your conclusion. And so going forward, and on the one that I'm working on now, I at least have something like an outline that I'm working against. Yeah. But it was a big challenge, mostly because of inexperience, and I just didn't know better. Yeah.
You heard it. There's another one coming. So I have a friend who has this theory that in the writing of fiction, every author is wrestling to answer some question, whether consciously or subconsciously. And if not to answer it, then at least to ask it. Yeah. Is other than can I do this and can I write a piece of long-form fiction?
Yeah.
What do you think there's a question that you're wrestling with, whether to ask or answer through the writing of Theo?
Yeah, I've not been asked that before, so forgive me that this is off the top of my head. Number one, what is important? And number two, why are we so mean? So when I started writing the book, this was, I think, around 20. It was before COVID. But y'all know what's happened in the country in the last 4 years. So much acrimony, so much division, and that was already in the air. Just this toxic anger that we seem to be swimming in these days. And so why, what makes us like that? And of course, there are probably lots of very profound answers to it. And then the second, what's important to us? I think if we get to the important stuff, then this other question kind of takes care of itself. And so I wanted to create a character that was aspirational for me. Some people have very, very mistakenly assumed that I used my life as the template for Theo. I would like to be like Theo, but I am nowhere close to this wonderful old man. But he is an aspiration that I have. I want to be like that, attentive, interested, curious, have a deep sense of wonder, a love, a welcome for people like this, no matter who you are, what you're like, what you think. And so in writing this character, I think what I was after was a model that I could kind of look up to myself. Yeah, but those would be the questions, I think. There are lots of others. But yeah, I think those two are the ones that I would land on.
Theo's attention and curiosity. Those are things that are spoken of and written about widely right now. We've said that if you're here, we assume that you've finished the book. And so, spoiler warning, do you think that that's something that Theo would have had to practice?
Yeah.
Is that something that he was born with and a gifting he grew into? Would it have been formed by circumstances? How do you think Theo came to be as curious and attentive as he is when he arrives in Golden?
Yeah, so I would put that question to all of us, right? Do you know someone that is that way? And what are the habits, what are the practices of their life that keep their minds and their hearts open to a sense of wonder? Thomas Carlyle, who was an author I read a lot when I lived in Scotland some years ago, once said that wonder is the basis of worship. And I think that to go into the world with a sense that there is this much bigger thing than any of us, and that, forgive me, but I will allude to my faith tonight, but that the fingerprints of God are all around us every day. I think we have to practice that presence and be mindful of it. As a singer-songwriter, one of the things that I really loved about that work, I love to write new songs. And so if I was playing in wherever, Kansas City tomorrow night, on the flight out, my piano player and I would sit together and I would try to write a couple of new songs on the plane. I just love to write. But what that did was it kind of worked into me this habit of looking for things every day to write songs about. And I began to notice, and I could excuse that on the grounds that that was my job. But what it became was, it became the thing that made life really rich. And I think that we can all practice that. For me, getting rid of the television, I'm not saying that works for anybody else or that anybody should do that, but that helped me. And I started paying more attention to words. I started paying more attention to conversations. I live in the country. I spend a lot of time outside. I do a lot of manual labor on the land where I live. And I do think that we have to practice habits. There has to be some stillness, some silence, some solitude, some Sabbath, some simplicity, those sorts of things. And what that does is just gives more space for our minds and our eyes to behold what's out there. And my guess is that you guys are all really good at that. You live in a beautiful place. And if you're not, that's okay. But if you want to be like that, if I want to be like that, then I think we do say, okay, how can I get that? I will say this, that the creative process of which I am enamored. I love to watch creative people work and see the work of creative souls. I was talking to Judith today at lunch. She's an artist. And Emily, today I was looking at your childhood art in the guest house. And I was just thinking how wonderful those 2 portraits that you did of yourself. I mean, you must have been a little girl, right? But creativity, to me, is one of the ways that we develop a keen sense of wonder. Because the creative process itself, I mean, if you are a person who believes in God as creator, then we know that he is creative. If you don't believe that, we still know that the creative process is a work of wonder in our lives and in our world. And so I think to do that every day has kind of instilled in me an attentiveness that I would not otherwise have had. So there's no virtue on my part that got me to where I am. I think for Theo, it's obvious that as an artist himself, and just the way that he spent his time, he kept a sense of wonder alive. Yeah.
And maybe he also got rid of his TV at some point.
Yeah, I don't think Theo had a TV.
So Theo is this mysterious figure who arrives in Golden, and hardly anything is known of him.
Right.
And he seems fairly intent to keep it that way.
Right.
And yet, by virtue of this attention and this presence and this curiosity, he fairly quickly comes to be viewed, as a friend says, as a trustworthy narrator of these stories of the people of Golden. And not just a trustworthy narrator, but a fairly competing and compelling narrator who is competing against some of the stories which these individuals have come to know and believe about themselves.
Right.
This proves to be a powerful experience, both for the individuals who are sitting next to him on the bench in front of the fetter, as well as for us as readers. I don't know. I will confess that when the book first came out, I'm a school teacher, and I would steal away during free periods to read just one more chapter because they're mercifully short. And I would find myself sitting in my big chair, and I would have tears running down my eyes as I would have just read. I would have just encountered Minette or the journalist or Kendrick. I go, I gotta go teach all these high school boys. I gotta pull it together. It was deeply moving.
Yeah, good. Thank
to
you.
see someone act as this trustworthy narrator.
Yeah.
Why do you think that it is so powerful, both for the individuals in the story as well as the readers, to encounter a new narrator?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Doesn't he ask great questions? Will and I have a friendship that goes back some years because I know his mom and dad, and if you wonder where he gets his chops from, he's got a mom and dad that are just magnificent people, and he knows that. And Will, I thank you for your work here tonight. Let me answer that in a couple of ways. So I live in this little town, and people ask me a lot of times, less than 1,000 people. It's a big spread out county. Our population is about 40,000 people. But you can, if you want, never see a neighbor or spend any time with anyone. And people ask me, don't you get lonely because I'm not married and I don't have a family? And don't you get bored? And I usually tell them to the first part of the question, everybody is lonely. It's just part of our eviction. It's part of where we are. Everybody is lonely, but I don't think I'm any lonelier than the most happily married people who I know. My life is very rich and blessed. And then to the question of don't you get bored, and I mean this in all sincerity, if I never left the county lines of where I live, I could never get to the bottom of opportunities to engage with people, and particularly people who hurt. There's just so much hurt everywhere. And so Theo, I think, recognizes that when he comes into the community. No matter where Theo goes, he didn't have to conjure up a new persona. I would like to think that as we read about that character, we think, well, he did this where he lived before here. He does it in New York City. He did it in Paris. He did it in South America. Wherever he lived, he did this. This is the modus operandi for him. You might notice that in the book there are two things that are conspicuously absent, especially for our day and time, and these were both intentional. One is no politics. There was not a political reference in the book that I can think of. And the second is there was no technology except on the park bench when Pierce Glisson sat down and was berating his daughter and Theo sang the Portuguese national anthem. You know, and then at Thanksgiving, Pierce brought his telephone and put it on the table. And that was intentional because if there is a theme that I think is most prominent in the book, it's the theme of incarnation. That the way that we best love one another is being personally present to one another. We can't do it digitally. We can't do it by pixels. We can't do it across the internet. We can approximate it. But Theo was a guy who wanted to be close enough that he could touch you and say something nice to you and hug you and love you. And that's the way, for me, Christ was. He was close to people. And so Theo, the character, to me says, you've got to be up close, you've got to be involved, you've got to be willing, you've got to be available for inconvenience. And again, that's why I aspire to be him, because I am none of those things naturally. But the fact that people hurt and that deep down inside we all desire, again, I'm speaking from a very personal perspective, what we all desire is unfailing love. And Theo, I think, gave that to people. And so I think that was kind of the magic potion, that he loved people where they were, and he knew that if I can scratch the surface just enough, I'm going to find out that there is hurt here, and there is some misperception that guy has about himself, that she has about herself, and we're going to do battle with that. And I'm going to try to convince this wounded soul, which all of us are, that you are capable of saintliness, and you are motherly, and you are beautiful, and you are good, because you're made in the image of God.
When the book came out, was it October, November?
Yeah, October.
October. I had finished reading it. You said 10 or 12 hours, but you must be a far faster reader than I am.
Oh, no.
But at some point, at some undisclosed time in November, I had finished the story and couldn't help but to talk about it in passing conversations. And at one point, as Christmas was approaching, someone shared, and it may have been one of you, someone shared that they have a practice of sharing a book with one of their in-laws as a Christmas tradition. And the individual asked if I thought that Theo might be a fair option. And the individual said, I do try to be really intentional not to give a gift that is political.
Right.
And the question was, is this book political? And I think I might push back on your answer.
Okay.
Because I struggled to answer that question, because I had just been deeply moved by Manette's story, as well as the account of Mr. Mendez and his daughter, and what Derek Prentice is wrestling with as he engages with that relationship. Yeah. And I thought, in some ways, the book is deeply political. And perhaps it corrects our view of politics, because it deals with faces and people. Yeah. And it asks, how will I treat my neighbor? And what does it look like to seek to discern or navigate between good justice and good mercy? And the line of, if you have to choose, always choose bad mercy. Because bad mercy doesn't hurt nearly as bad as bad justice. And so in some ways the book is deeply political. And yet, if you were to try to guess the characters' affiliations, I don't think that you could do it.
Right. And maybe the better word, thank you for that. I love an interviewer who will push back and say, Allen, you're wrong. Maybe the better word is partisan. There's no partisanship in the book. And no matter what court, our little Guatemalan man, true story, I'll tell you about that in just a moment. No matter what court he's in, he's still subject to the vagaries of our human imperfections, regardless of what the judge's affiliation is or partisanship is, the DA, we all fall prey to that. And so in the court, anybody who goes is somewhat subject to the winds or the winds of justice or injustice that happen to hit them there. When I was probate judge, I also handled the misdemeanor criminal cases in our county. And one day I was sitting in my office, and a couple of the deputies brought in is it Mendez in the book? The reason that I ask is, I know his name, and I was going to keep his name in the book, but I was thinking this might jeopardize him, so I took his name out and changed it. But I wrote it in a little prayer book that I use in the mornings, and I still pray for him. But the deputies brought this very small and very, very frightened man into my office, and he couldn't speak English, so I got a translator to come to the office, and we had a really wonderful conversation. And as I tended to do whenever someone came to my office, we sat across a small table, and I held his hands just to let him know I'm not your enemy. And so we had this great conversation, and I told him, or asked him, would you tell me your story? And it was exactly what's in the book. Now, nobody got killed. The crime that I dealt with was minor. But his daughter had cancer. She lived in Georgia. He was sent out of the country, and he said, I could not stay away from my wife and daughter. And, regardless of what your politics are about the issue, he was a living person. Theo would have said, I love you. And my job at that moment was to administer justice, which I did. And I think it was good justice. It was well meted out. But to me, that was kind of the high point of the book, Theo. And when Kendrick talks to the DA and says, you never looked at me. And I don't fault the DA. The workload that is on some of our public servants is unreasonably high. But if you're a defendant and your freedom is at stake, you would like to think that somebody, even on the other side, cares a little bit about getting this right. I think I didn't answer your question, but I sure said a lot.
So I was reluctant to ask this question because for a more careful reader, I think you have answered it in the book. But just in case there are those in the audience who have like reading comprehension to me, I have been curious. You said you began writing the book in 2020, and that one of those foundational questions was, why are people so mean?
Yeah.
And how can we be so divided? And you mentioned earlier that in some ways the book has only grown into the times, or perhaps the times have grown into the book. And it is only now more needed than it was then.
Yeah.
I have wondered, if you were to add a chapter to the book, and if it were to be October of 2024, and Theo is in this small town, while still maintaining that the book would clearly remain nonpartisan, how do you think that Theo would have inhabited our current moment of division and echo chambers?
Yeah.
What might that chapter have looked like? Have you thought about it?
I haven't, but that's a wonderful question. My niece asked me yesterday, have you talked to Will about any of the questions he's going to ask you? And I'm wishing now that I had. No, so here's the answer, though. I think this is the answer that I would give. I wouldn't change anything. If I added another chapter, it would be very risky to inject the partisan divide, but it might be kind of nice for Theo to have a heated but civil conversation with somebody who doesn't like something about the way that he approaches life. I can't imagine him engaging in a political argument. But to me, the message of the book is that is important, and it is. I mean, it is terribly important, the political processes and the responsibility we have there. But if you live in a little town of 1,000 people, you kind of learn early on, nobody up there cares about us. And that may sound a little bit mean-spirited or woe is me, but you really do kind of figure out. Wendell Berry writes eloquently about this, if you like Wendell Berry, that the laws that are going to come down are the laws that are going to come down, and we're going to have to live with them. But what can I do that will not be affected by the laws? So we can still go read to kids at the elementary school. I can still have people to my house for supper that are different than me, very different than me. We can still go to a concert together. We can still do a lot of things that remove us from that one area of our culture where division is just the name of the game. And so this may be cowardly on my part personally, honestly, and on Theo's as well, but avoidance is, I think, the way, to some extent, to deal with it. Do what you can do. Love your neighbor as yourself, whatever that means. Vote responsibly. Try to be informed. But tomorrow, regardless of, where the chips fall, get up the next day and do the same thing. Love people. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Sure sounds like a life invested in little, nameless, unremembered acts.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you could never leave Harris County and not get to the bottom of the stories and the hurt that is around you. Right. At lunch today, someone was asking about the evening and what the book was about. They hadn't read it. And I said, it's about chapter 35. And they said, whoa, you know the book. Well, I think it really is about chapter 35. And there's a quiz coming. In 35...
I'm not kidding. I have no idea what's in chapter 35.
Theo and Asher are in line together at the coffee shop.
Oh, yes.
And Theo has had this aha moment.
Oh, yeah.
As he has recognized that one of the things that makes Asher's portrait so distinct is the sadness that he draws. And I'm going to read a quote to you, and this is a long quote, and that's poor form, but I think y'all are signals best and brightest, so hang with me. It says, the universe, but to these old eyes, it is in every face that is sadness, the universal affliction. It is what gives such gravitas to your portraits and makes them so believable. Even when your subjects are smiling, the shadow of sadness is there. And so far, my meetings at the Feder only confirm my suspicion. Theo goes on to say, there is no virtue in advertising one's sadness, but there is no wisdom in denying it either. And there is the beautiful possibility that great love can grow out of sadness if it is well tended. Sadness can make us bitter or wise. We get to choose. So I do portraits of sadness, Asher muttered to himself. Is that a compliment? Theo chuckled. It is a very high compliment, young man. A very high compliment indeed. Perhaps I am mistaken, but at some point, if we are wise, we must all confront our sadness, our brokenness, our disappointment. I am quite certain that your portraits help some people in a very tender and courteous way to ask themselves, maybe for the first time, who is that person? What do I know to be true, really true about that face? Asher, we are masters at masking our sadness, but deep down inside, if we are honest, we know that there is an unsatisfied longing deep inside all of us. Your portraits invite people to be alone and quiet and truthful with themselves, to admit the longing and to discover the goodness in their sadness. Maybe. Asher held his peace, oblivious to the presence of customers around him. Narrowed eyes and wrinkled brow expressed his keen concentration. Asher, please don't understand me. You don't draw portraits of sadness. You draw portraits of people. Sadness is only one part. There is beauty and gladness and playfulness too. It's all there in elegant proportion.
That's good.
It is good. Allen, what is said...
I know who's going to do the audible version.
Allen, what Theo says of Asher could well be said of you. Would you tell us, what has the experience been like, or what have you learned from writing portraits of people in which there is sadness in elegant proportion?
Yeah. So I don't know that I would say learned as much as maybe reaffirmed or contributed to a deeper understanding. And this may be a function of age. You know, at 21, 22, I probably would not have thought anybody in the world had any sadness. But after a life of litigation and a life of just growing up in the world, the weight of hurt that is in the world. And it does not, and let me be real clear about that, it does not destroy the joy that's at the other end of the spectrum. So years ago, I wrote a song, and it's one of the very few that is, to me, overtly religious. Because as a musician, I most enjoyed playing for groups that had no religious affiliation. But I like to sing songs that maybe just provoke people to think. But there was one song that I wrote once about Jesus. And it says, he seemed a walking contradiction, perfect joy and perfect sadness. His perfect sanity seemed madness in this world where he's a stranger. And I think if he felt the sadness of the world, he was a man of sorrows acquainted with grief, then there's no way that we're going to escape it. You know, whether we inflict it on ourselves or it's forced on us by someone else. And again, this is not an invitation to be morose. It's not an invitation to be judgmental or harsh or down on the world. It's just reality. And at the other end of the spectrum, there is this perfect joy, or close to perfect joy, that we can live in. But we can only get there if we say, okay, we got a problem. And let's recognize it, call it what it is, and try to understand where it came from. I hope I'm preaching to the choir. I mean, my 6-year-old great niece is here tonight, but I'm guessing that outside of her, all of us have seen a lot of hurt in life. And it's okay to admit it and say, okay, I'm gonna keep doing tomorrow what I know I should do today. I'm gonna love my neighbors and myself and love God.
Allen, you mentioned there how there can be a sense of reluctance to perhaps to advertise your faith. And those are my words, not yours. You'll correct me in a moment, I hope. Theo, we also encountered this, what seems like a persistent reluctance in Theo,
Right.
particularly in his relationship with Tony,
Yeah.
which I would imagine might be a favorite of many of ours out of the book. Would you share with us some of the thinking behind Theo's reluctance and also his choice to share in moments but not in others?
Yeah, gosh, that's such a good question. Yeah, so, and that was very intentional on my part. Again, as a musician, I want to sing to as many people as I can sing to. And so I tended to write about things that everybody experienced: childhood, parenthood, being in love, work. I try to write about a wide berth of subjects. And there was very little reference overtly to anything divine in the songs. They were just observations about life, and they asked questions. So a lot of people have, when I've heard them describe the book, they say, this is a book about kindness. That's fine. It is a book about kindness. I would also like to think that if someone is willing to go there, they would realize that it is a book about the reason for Theo's kindness. And he makes a lot of reference to heaven, right? He talks about that a lot. Tony it kind of rags him about that a bit. They play one another about the inclusion of Theo's insistence about heaven. And part of that, just to be absolutely honest with you, I didn't want to run off a reader who would benefit from a good story because I was trying to force something into the narrative. If anybody asks me, I will sit down and talk for hours about what I think to be true about God and my faith. I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not embarrassed by it. But I know there are a lot of people who don't really care to hear it. And they deserve to read good books. And I read a lot of books by people who don't believe those things. And I love their writing. And the profundity of what they bring to the mind is so much deeper than what a lot of religious type of writers do. So when I wrote the book, I was extremely sensitive to that. Tony, I think, is a really wonderful foil for Theo. But again, it gave Theo a chance to express himself like this rather than like this. And I wanted that to come through loud and clear. I will give you all a little preview of where these stories are going. So I'm writing one about Ellen now. And it's an earthy story. She has a hard story. How does someone become so eccentric and so intelligent? And to me, the answer is trauma. And so I'm working on that one now. But there is a third one that I would really like to write, and it will be about Tony, and a friendship that he has with Father Lundy, who was the man who eulogized Theo. He was just a bit player in the novel. We don't know much at all about him. But in that book, the way that I'm envisioning it now, they formed this really interesting friendship where they agree to disagree, and they talk about their love for Theo and the impact that he had on them. And one of the things that we will learn is that Theo and Father Lundy spent lots of time together. And so there will be more theological content in the book. And, you know, I'll pull back the covers a little bit there. And if somebody doesn't want to read it, they don't have to. I hope they will have benefited from 1 and 2. But that was intentional. And again, you know, the kind of the conflict that I have with myself is I don't want to deny my faith or what I believe to be the best thing in the world, and certainly the best thing that I've ever experienced. I don't want to disown that, but I do want to be mindful of the fact that there are a lot of people who just don't care to go there right now. And I believe me, I'm a man of prayer. I have prayed over this book many times, that it would reach every heart in some kind of way. So you were talking a minute ago about reading chapters between classes and crying. I have heard, as you probably have, that good art makes us feel something. And I find it extremely gratifying that the story, from what I can tell, is making people feel something. And then I can just, you know, I can trust that whatever that is will lead to some good place.
Mm-hmm. Speaking about the influence of the book, I confess that I'm not a numbers person, so many of you will need you to crunch the numbers for us afterwards, but I have this theory that of all the books in publication, if you were to account for the number of total books purchased and look at the proportion of books which have been given away, I have a theory that Theo may be one of the most given books per purchase, asterisk, of any book in print. Why did you suspect that in writing it? Did you know that it would prompt this generosity? Why do you think that we finish the book and there is this burden of, oh, I got to share this with somebody?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that. I'm so happy it's happened that way. But I honestly, I mean, when I say that I did not write this book to be published, that is no stretch. I did not. And since we published it, I've not read, I mean, I don't know what's in chapter 35. I did read the Christmas letter last year just for a little thing on the internet. But when we released it, I mean, Aaron and I were just hoping that anybody would be interested in it. And again, my prayer was that people would benefit from it. But the fact that people have shared it is just, we're over the moon about that. We are self-published. So I experienced this as a musician. You know, there was a time you could go play a gig and sell CDs and that sort of thing. Well, about 2008, that dried up because streaming started to take over the way that we listen to music. And it has been a real challenge to vocational musicians. Well, being unfamiliar with books, Aaron and I, you know, we talked about maybe talking to a publisher, but I said, Aaron, I don't even know if this book is worth anybody's time and attention, much less somebody in the book world. And we have no leverage if we wanted to ask for anything that we think would serve the book. And so Erin, my dear niece, who is just a really smart person, she's been working to try to figure out how do we let the world know that this book is out there. And we have discovered we cannot do it, but you can do it. And thank God, I mean, maybe this is an answer to prayer. Lord, if this can serve anybody, would you do something with it? And so, you know, people have been so gracious to share the story. And, I mean, y'all can answer better than I can why you want to share it. But we're awfully grateful. And if you happen to be one of those, thank you and keep up the good work.
If one were to summarize the story, in some sense, there is a mysterious figure who we learn later is an artist and creator himself.
Right.
And images prove a consistent and major theme throughout the book. But not just the making of images, which is there, but the bestowal of one's image upon a person.
Yeah.
And not just that, but the way that as Theo comes and bestows these images, in some ways he is restoring the image of this community in a way that leaves people transformed. As I've read at different times, I have cried each time, but it's been at different points. And one of the points that sung to me this time was that it's Mrs. Gidley who pays for the hotel room for the Mendez family to be reunited. And it's Ellen who gives all of her earnings, contrary to the advice of her trusted consultant, to the purchase of Simone's new cello. And so somehow in receiving their image, they have been made more whole and are simultaneously more themselves, and yet they also bear the image in this deeply themself way of this man who came to town. In some ways, it's a story of a people who see a glimpse of someone who bears the image of goodness and love and beauty. And by seeing his face and knowing that he sees them, a people are transformed. And yet you, my friend, wrote the book and are still Allen Levi. Would you speak to the experience of having written the character of Theo, this person, the aspirational character that he is, and yet having to go to bed at night and you're still Allen and you're not Theo?
Yeah. Is that a compliment? You could have stopped before the question, and that would have been a beautiful recitation about the book. No, like I said earlier, the character is aspirational to me. And I will tell you a scene that I was working on in the new book just yesterday. At one point, let me get the characters right. Ellen is talking to a visitor to Golden, and she's sitting on Theo's bench, and she's telling the visitor all about Theo and the way that Theo made her conscious of people's faces and the things that he saw in her. But she makes reference to this stranger, that sometimes the hardest face for us to forgive or accept is our own face. And we need someone to affirm us. Little children need that all the time, don't they? They have more than we do probably, but they still need it. And as we get older, we need to be told that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, and that we have this mysterious power of judgment and misjudgment. And we bear this image of something so much bigger than us. So in writing the character, I think I was kind of preaching to myself, Allen, you do not believe this about yourself, and I don't. That's why it's so hard to say I'm an author now. I just can't quite, I don't believe that about myself. And there are a lot of times I don't believe that there's really much goodness in me. And I know that it's dangerous to go there too enthusiastically. But I want to hear that myself, that I'm capable of saintliness, and that I can contribute to the life of the world, and you can contribute to the life of the world. And this character is insistent in bringing that to everybody, whether they accept it or not. You were asking a minute ago if I were to add maybe a chapter. There was that one chapter where the boyfriend tore up the girl's portrait. But it might have been interesting for Theo to have a bad bestowal, a really bad one. You know, where the person just says, you are full of it. This is, who are you anyway, kind of thing. Even then, Theo would have been insistent, you're still capable of saintliness. There's still a lot of good in you. But it's just like sadness. We can choose to live in that, or we can choose to live outside of it. You know, the choice is ours. Yeah. But tonight I will go to bed and I will still be Allen Levi.
So I have one more question because we're about out of time.
Are we almost out of time?
We are almost out of time. But I have heard that it is a shame to end with logistics. And so we're not going to end with logistics. We're going to put logistics here, and then we're going to end on a good one.
Okay.
So we owe tonight a debt of gratitude to two individuals who are spring-loaded for laughter, who are luminaries in this community and champions of literacy. And I want us to thank again Beth Newbold and Deborah Blake for putting this event together.
So let me interrupt you real quickly. My brother Gary, who died 12 years ago, he was my hero in life, and he's still my Theo. He is the real deal to me. But one of the things that Gary used to preach was that one of the most underutilized gifts of really life anywhere in America, he would have specified the church maybe, is the home and the dinner table. And so last night when Aaron and Nora Jane and I arrived, we pulled up to the Blake's house, and we pull over to the side of the road. They all stand up. They begin to applaud. And we had the most wonderful meal. And it was Theo incarnate. I don't see where Deborah is right now. But, of course, Beth was there. Carter couldn't be there. There she is. And then Carol and Thad were there. And Emily was there. And it was just a feast. And that was my introduction to Signal Mountain. And if y'all are anything like that, I might be moving up here real soon.
So not now, but in a moment, we will leave this space, and there will be books available for purchase in the gallery, and there will be dessert and coffee in the cafeteria. So once we finish here, you're invited to go to either and both of those two spaces to enjoy some more time together. Alan, I have one more question. I wonder if Theo were to have purchased your portrait, and if he were to have spent some time with it over the dinner table or the easy chair next to him, and then if the two of you were to sit on a bench together, what do you think that he would say and see in that portrait? And what do you hope that he would say and see in that portrait?
So let me tell you a story. My 5 friends who came down to visit at the farm like they do every year, once I had given them the manuscript and they read it and they insisted, you have got to do something with this. The next year when they came back, we were getting ready to go eat supper as we do every year during that weekend, Saturday evening, 5:36, something like that. And a couple of us were standing out in the parking area right next to my house, and a van pulled down my driveway. I live way back in the woods, so no van has any business pulling down my driveway. And I didn't recognize it, and they just kind of sped by the house. You've been there. Sped by the house, and I said, I'm going to get in my truck and go find out who that is. And so I was walking toward my truck, and the van whipped around and came back and pulled right up next to me. And a chef got out of the van. And then a sous chef got out of the van. And I still couldn't connect the dots. And then I turned around and my buddies were smiling, and I realized, okay, this is something. And while we were out in the parking lot, 3 of them had gone inside and they had set the dinner table. And they had gotten the fine china. We had this beautiful bottle of port. And they put name tags at every seat. And everybody took a seat, and they had Theo's at mine, and they said, you've got to sit here. And so we ate the meal, and they talked about the book, and they were glowing. It was very uncomfortable but wonderful at the same time, you know. And at the end of the meal, they brought out this large object and kind of propped it up on the table, and they said, pull the paper back. And it was the portrait of me. And so for the next 10 or 15 minutes, they did what you just suggested Theo might have done. And they said, Alan, You are a writer. You are a storyteller. We believe in you. And I promise one meal like that has the power to change a life. And so I'm deeply indebted to them. The things that they said is beside the point. But the fact that they loved me that way, they know all of my faults. That's what we do each year, is we kind of do an inventory of everywhere we've messed up. They know all of them. But they could see through every bit of that. And they could say, you are one wonderful human being. And that's what I hope people take from the book. And that's what I want you to know tonight. That you are capable of saintliness. And no matter what kind of muck and mire you've got in your life, every one of you bear the image of God. And every one of you is a wonderful human being. So says Theo.
I'd like to close with one more excerpt. Our hearts burned within us. Their hearts burned within them. Father Lundy allowed the phrase to linger in silence for a few seconds before he resumed. We all walk roads of various descriptions in life. The long and winding road, the road to ruin, easy street, the road less traveled. Along the way, there are questions, there is news, there are concerns and fears and uncertainties that furrow our brows, trouble our souls, and break our hearts. Death terrifies many of us. But God, in his sublime goodness, has always sent others, mysterious others, to walk with us. Prophets, preachers, friends, teachers, artists, storytellers, wives and husbands, children, songbirds and rivers, even hardship and loss, to help us see clearly. They are ones who make our hearts burn within us, who call us out of our indifference, our lethargy, our death and defeat. They call us to be fully alive, or at least more alive than we were when we met them. And so, Theo, for a year, for however long it took you to finish the book, he was in our midst. And now, looking back, can't we say that when we were with him, our hearts burned within us, our souls stood on tiptoe, our eyes recognized something good and true, and our minds could believe, if not fully, then ever so slightly, that love and heaven and forgiveness are the most real thing that we can know in this world. Allen, if a ledger of the world's gladness is maintained somewhere, then I think we can be confident that it has been credited with a considerable deposit from all of our meetings at the Feder. I know that my life, and I trust that our lives, are richer because of yours. Thank you.